The funeral of one of the towering figures of the 20th century, Mikhail Gorbachev, is taking place today. Ironically, whilst he helped reunite a Europe divided by the post-war Iron Curtain, he divided his own country between reformists, people like him, and the old-school communists who, to this day, dream of a greater Mother Russia and her lost empire. But Vladimir Putin says he's too busy to attend. Well, joining me live now in the studio is GBNews' economics and business editor, Liam Halligan, certainly a friend of mine, but actually you booked your place on the sofa today because you lived and worked in Moscow, in Russia, for 6 years. You wrote for great organs like The Economist and other people, and you met him several times.
I did meet him several times. I, in particular, covered the 96 presidential election, which is obviously after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That was the election that saw the reinstatement in power of Boris Yeltsin of what was then had become the Russian Federation. Gorbachev ran in that election, and unfortunately he humiliated himself. He barely troubled the scorers, to use a cricket analogy. And that really goes to the heart of his legacy. He is revered in the Western world as the man who was seen to have facilitated the collapse of the Soviet Union, ironically, because he actually set out to strengthen the Soviet Union. But he's not revered in Russia. There's still a real ambivalence about him, as reflected in the fact that he isn't going to be buried in the walls of the Kremlin, like most Soviet-era leaders. Like Khrushchev, he is going to be buried in Novodevichy, in a suburb of Russia. Khrushchev has a grave that's made, been there many times, made out of black and white stone to portray the kind of two sides of him in the eyes of the Russian people, of course, because Khrushchev criticised Stalin famously. And it may be that Gorbachev's monument is similarly dualistic. The Russians love dualism and subtlety. And it's certainly quite a big statement by Putin to say he's too busy to attend the funeral of a leader of the Soviet Union. Yeah.
I've had a couple of minor clashes with people on social media about it because like you, we both covered the Berlin Wall back in '89. And to me, the profound legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev is to be found in countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, now two countries in its own right, because they grabbed what he'd offered, Lech Wałęsa in the Polish shipyards in Gdansk, and they ran with openness, glasnost, perestroika, but they did it economically. Those countries are utterly transformed.
So Gorbachev was born in southern Russia in a very small agricultural village called Privolnyye, but Privolnyye is near what was then Stalingrad, which is now Volgograd, the site of the most brutal, pivotal, decisive battle on the Eastern Front. And a young Mikhail Gorbachev, he watched, the burly young men of his village go off to war, and many of them never come back, a few of them coming back maimed and wounded for the rest of their lives. And that instilled in him the fact that he grew up among the Russian narod, the Soviet people who actually had to get on the sharp end of wars. It instilled in him a real aversion to violence his whole life. And that's why, Alistair, unlike Khrushchev in the 50s when the Hungarians revolted, he sent in the tanks. Unlike Brezhnev in the 60s when the Czechoslovakia revolted, he sent in the tanks. Gorbachev didn't send in the tanks when Eastern European countries, which then were behind the Iron Curtain, part of what you and I used to call Comecon, the kind of Soviet Union sphere of influence, he let them secede from Soviet influence, partly because he didn't want to attack them. There was some violence in what was then the Soviet Union and the Baltic states when they tried to revolt under Gorbachev. It was quite short-lived, but it still happened. And there'll be people watching this whose relatives died in that. It wasn't that he was completely against violence, but he had a real aversion to violence, given that he was in charge of a dictatorship.
And on the economic front, both Ronnie Reagan and Margaret Thatcher embraced him.